beginning Chapter 7 of Surprise Kill Vanish by Annie Jacobson. The KGB's Office of Liquid Affairs. Through the 1950s, the president's advisors continued to see the Soviets as the cause of anti-American acts and sentiment they could otherwise not explain. At the same time, Moscow remained hyper-focused on controlling the public's perception of communism. From 1954 onward, the CIA believed that the Kremlin was behind the recent spat of emigre kidnappings and assassinations in Eastern Europe. Too many community leaders who'd spoken out against the Soviet Union were winding up, disappeared, or dead. For the most part, this was speculative. If only the CIA had hard evidence. The hit-and-run ambushes were brazen and bold, often occurring in broad daylight on city streets. Finally, in 1954, the CIA got the evidence it was looking for in the strange case of KGB assassin Captain Nikolai Evangelovich Koholov. Captain Koholov was a shy man, quiet and unassuming. His first career before the Second World War was a theatrical performer. His special talent was whistling. Now here he was, standing in a hallway in Frankfurt, Germany, a KGB assassin on a mission to kill. It was April 1954, and everything in Koholov's life was about to change. He rang the doorbell above a small nameplate that read, Gregory Severovich Okolov, Russian by birth. Okolov was an outspoken Soviet emigre and chief of operations of Popular Labor Alliance of Russian Solidarists, a virulently anti-communist group in West Germany. The door opened. The two men stood face to face. Gregory Severovich, Koholov asked. Da, said the man. Yes, I am he. I have come to you from Moscow, Koholov said. The Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union has ordered your assassination. The murder is entrusted to my group. I cannot let this murder happen. The target, Gregory Okolovich, let the assassin, Nikolai Koholov, inside. Koholov sat down, presented his credentials, and went over the details of the plan. Then he begged for help. He couldn't go on like this, Koholov said, overseeing the deaths of people the Kremlin wanted killed. Koholov wanted to switch sides, to betray his country and defect to the West. If Okolovich were willing to help him, they would both live. And so, assassination as a secret weapon in the battle between East and West moved out of the shadows and into the public eye. 1 week later, on April 22nd, Captain Nikolai Evangelovich Koholov took to the podium at the press conference in Bonn, Germany. He announced to the world that he was an assassin for the KGB. A crisis of conscience had prevented him from killing, he said. The KGB was evil and had to be stopped, he warned. As proof, he revealed yet another Soviet covert action operation that had been carried out the week before. While Koholov was being debriefed by U.S. intelligence agents in Bonn, a second assassination team dispatched by the KGB and had succeeded in kidnapping and assassinating an anti-Soviet emigre named Alexander Tushkanovich. Okolovich's counterpart at the Popular Labor Alliance of Russian solidarists in Berlin. At first, the CIA was suspicious of Koholov. His story sounded apocryphal. The more likely scenario was that Koholov was a double agent, a Soviet mole. But after a few days of questioning, Koholov's American handler became convinced he was indeed a KGB assassin who had experienced a crisis of conscience that led to an ideological shift. In the Cold War battle between the United States and the USSR, most defecting was done from east to west, which made Russia look bad. The Soviet Union spent time and treasure trying to control the free world's perception of communism, which is why outspoken anti-Soviet emigres like Grigory Akolovich and Alexander Tushkanovich were high on the assassination list. Now, so too was Koholov. Adding to the drama of his defection was the fact that he carried with him physical evidence of the Soviet-led assassination plot. The weapon the KGB had given him was a cunning little close-quarters killing machine, a poison dart gun disguised to look like a cigarette pack. At first glance, the two rows of tightly packed smokes appeared normal, but Koholov demonstrated how, with the press of a secret button, a 4-inch long dart gun sprang forth, capable of firing small, poison-tipped bullets into a victim. The weapon's delivery system was no louder than a snap of the fingers, Koholov demonstrated, and designed to be fired in a public space without notice. In Koholovich's debrief, the CIA learned quite a bit about the unusual man, codenamed Whistler, including his intelligence activities during the war, when higher-ups in the KGB's predecessor organization, the NKVD, People's Commissariat for International Affairs, learned that the blonde, blue-eyed Koholov spoke German and could whistle. They foresaw an excellent disguise for a wartime covert agent. In 1941, Koholov was recalled from a frontline infantry unit, indoctrinated by the NKVD, and sent for paramilitary training, where he learned assassination techniques behind enemy lines. He studied infiltration and exfiltration techniques, reconnaissance tradecraft, hand-to-hand combat skills, and the art of silent killing. Similar training to OSS operators. In the fall of 1943, Koholov had parachuted into Belarus under cover of night, where he linked up with Soviet partisans and oversaw the assassination of Nazi Generalkommissar Wilhelm Kube, the Butcher of Belarus. Koholov, it seemed, was the communist version of the Special Operations executives Jan Kubis and Joseph Gablek, the commandos who assassinated SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, the Butcher of Prague. After the war, Nikolai Koholov went to work for Russian intelligence, posing as a German, a Pole, and a Romanian. In 1954, after the death of Stalin, the NKVD became the KGB, and Koholov was called back to Moscow. He began to have second thoughts about being a professional assassin right around the time he was sent to Frankfurt to kill Grigory Akolovich. During Koholovich's debrief, the CIA learned information it coveted. The KGB's assassination unit was called the 12th Department and was divided into sections, or directions, by countries or groups of countries, such as, for example, the United States, the principal enemy, England, Latin America, etc. According to Kolovich, the 12th Department headquarters in Moscow maintained 50 to 60 experienced employees and was headed by a general named Nikolai B. Rodin, who under the alias Korovin had previously been the KGB resident in Great Britain. Secrecy regarding assassination operations was maintained through careful selection of agents and the specialized training of Soviet personnel. The officers do not discuss their experience among others. Department documents are not circulated. Koholov's handlers learned if an assassination plot were ever recorded, it would be kept track of under the code phrase executive action within the KGB Directorate of Liquid Affairs, also known as wet matters. The 12th Department had 2 secret weapon laboratories whose scientists worked on weapons for executive action operations. One of these laboratories, codenamed Laboratory Number 12, produced special weapons and explosive devices. It was here that the Soviets engineered and prepared deadly tools of assassination, from drawing up blueprints to melting and pouring bullets. A second lab, called Gamera, or the Chamber, developed poisons and drugs for special tasks. Stalin personally oversaw the creation of the Gamera lab, Koholov said, which was located in a suburb outside Moscow called Kuchino. The laboratory housed a torture chamber, a place where death row prisoners were used as guinea pigs, injected with different powders, beverages, and liquors to test the effectiveness of various types of injections. One high priority effort for the scientists and engineers at Gamera, Koholov said, was to create poisons that would be undetectable in an autopsy. Only a handful of high-level persons were ever allowed to enter this classified facility. Koholov had never been to Gamera, he said, but he knew people who had. All assassins were trained in the art of kidnapping, the preferred hit-and-run tactic of the 12th Department. The Russian strike force units were called combat groups. Each consisted of a Soviet staff officer, like Koholov, augmented by a team of indigenous agents, local assets familiar with customs and terrain near where a target lived. On the mission to kill Grigory Akolovich, Koholov had been assigned to work with 2 German-born KGB agents he identified as Hans Kukowicz, and Kurt Weber. All combat group paramilitary operators were armed and prepared to perform executive action when required to do so, either in time or peace of war, or either in time of peace or war, Koholov said. The list of Soviet targets for assassination was long, particularly among the anti-communist emigre community. The members of the Politburo guarded a reputation they constructed for themselves and were determined to stamp out dissent. The best way to silence former citizens who threatened the facade was to kidnap and assassinate them. The assassination of some emigre leaders are often carried out so skillfully as to leave the impression that the victims died from natural causes, reads a declassified CIA report. The individuals who died were reportedly victims of an apparent heart attack, suicide, fall, or traffic accident. Other emigre leaders were wanted for information they had. These people were targeted for kidnapping by a direct action strike force called Combat Action Team. The paramilitary team followed orders from the Directorate of Liquid Affairs. The CIA had a thick dossier of the disappeared emigres, to which Koholov added several names. There was Walter Lintz, president of the Association of Free German Jurists, lawyers, kidnapped off the streets of Berlin in July of 1952, a 13-man KGB combat action team, never to be seen again. There was Bohomil Lausman, an outspoken anti-communist Czech who disappeared from Vienna in 1953 and was later reported to have been taken to a Soviet gulag, where he died. The Ukrainian national Valery P. Tremel was grabbed off the streets of Linz, Austria in June 1954, never to be seen or heard from again. From his high-profile defection to the West and his refusal to kill on moral grounds, Koholov was featured in Time magazine and Life magazine and in a 4-part series in the Sunday Evening Post, I Would Not Murder for the Soviets. When he testified for Congress, he made the Soviet Union sound downright diabolical. He spoke of Soviet death camps, brutal police tactics, and the machine gunning of citizens who'd gathered to resist totalitarian rule. Under oath, he swore that while members of the elite enjoy very good living conditions, the ordinary man in the Soviet Union is treated as a slave. Embraced by the United States, Koholov soon became the target of the KGB to assassinate their former assassin. The KGB ordered scientists in the 12th Department, now renamed the 13th Department, to develop a special toxin undetectable in an autopsy. They wanted a poison that would first disfigure him and then bring about a long, slow, excruciatingly painful death. Not as much for revenge, but to send a clear message to anyone who might be thinking about betraying Russia 3 years past. In 1958, Koholov traveled to Germany to give a speech at a convention of anti-communist emigres gathered at the Palmgarten Conservatory in Frankfurt. During a break, he was sitting at a terrace cafe, enjoying a cup of coffee when he became lightheaded. There weren't many people around, he recalled, just a few beer drinkers, sipping the coffee. He suddenly thought that it tasted funny. Never mind, he thought, and got up and went into the conservatory's concert hall to enjoy the opera being performed. His ears started ringing. He felt nauseated. His vision blurred. Things began to whirl. He later told the CIA. Koholov staggered out of the parking lot, found the car he was driving, and somehow made it back to his hotel, stopping to vomit several times along the way. In the hotel foyer, he collapsed and lost consciousness. Taken to Frankfurt University Hospital, he awoke to learn he'd been diagnosed with a basic case of gastritis. But his condition quickly worsened and worsened. Soon, his entire body turned a copper-colored red. My mind began disintegrating, he recalled. He could not accurately determine if he was dreaming or awake. He lost the ability to count beyond 10. days passed. A nurse came into the room, looked at him and froze. Then she screamed and ran out. Looking in the mirror, Koholov saw he was covered in black and blue marks, patches of skin that were mottled brown. His pillowcase was covered in blood. My face had turned into a mask reminiscent of a Boris Karloff monster, he remembered. When he reached up to touch his hair, huge tufts fell out. In Washington, D.C., the Pentagon received word of what had happened to Nikolai Koholov. The Defense Department swung into action, sending American military physicians to bring Koholov under their care. His white blood cell count had fallen from the normal level of 6,000 to 7,000 down to 700. Doctors took bone marrow samples. His blood-building cells were dying off. The test samples came back. He'd been poisoned by some kind of radioactive isotope. Doctors gave him very little chance of recovery. Then, after a week of blood transfusion, Koholov somewhat miraculously recovered. It was the CIA that concluded that Koholov had been poisoned with radioactive thallium, a deadly toxin, likely created by Soviet scientists in their Kamera lab. The poison had been engineered to work in a diabolically clever fashion, an analyst wrote, designed to produce an initial display of symptoms doctors would almost certainly misdiagnose as generic gastritis. The assassins, assumed to be from the KGB's Directorate of Liquid Affairs, had probably posed as waiters at the Palmagraten Conservatory Terrace Cafe, where one of them had slipped a few drops of radioactive thallium into Koholov's coffee cup. Just 1 week after Nikolai Koholov was released from the American Military Hospital in Frankfurt, the Directorate of Liquid Affairs struck again. This time they succeeded in poisoning a high-profile anti-communist Ukrainian politician named Lev Rebet, killing him. The assassination occurred in Munich, Germany, in the stairwell of a newspaper office where Rebet had been working with a reporter to expose Kremlin-sponsored assassinations. In World War II, Rebet was the leader of the Ukrainian government until he was arrested by the Gestapo in 1941. He'd survived imprisonment at Stockenhausen concentration camp, only to be killed by a KGB assassin with a poisoned dart gun in an office building stairwell. Initially, Rebet's death was reported as being from natural causes. The autopsy that followed his collapse in the stairwell stated the cause of death as a heart attack. But 4 years later, in 1961, a second KGB assassin, Bohdan Stahinsky, defected to Berlin, surrendering himself to West Germany, authorities who had turned him over to the CIA. At a U.S. facility in Frankfurt, Stahinsky spent weeks in the custody of the CIA, interrogated by an officer named William Hood. Stahinsky told Hood that he was assigned to the Directorate of Liquid Affairs and that he'd assassinated Lev Rebet with a specially crafted poison gun, a tiny weapon with which he'd sprayed atomized hydrogen cyanide directly into Rebet's face. He described watching Rebet crumple over and die right in front of him. Until Nikolai Koholov, Bohdan Stahinsky did not experience a crisis of conscience. He was a double agent. In 2011, at the age of 80, he revealed in an interview with Ukrainian journalist Natalia Prikhotko, I ain't trying that over, that he was always a committed communist and had been sent by the Kremlin to turn himself in, win the good graces of the CIA, and continue his work as a Soviet mole. Bohdan Stahinsky served 8 years in a German prison for the murder of Lev Rebet. This light sentence was likely a result of the lie he propagated, that he couldn't bear to be an assassin and instead turned himself in. After Stahinsky's release in 1966, he went to Washington to work with the CIA, but they suspected a double game. He says he was sent to a backwater post in Panama. After a few years with no access to anything important, Stahinsky was extricated and transported to Paraguay by the KGB. He went to Africa, had plastic surgery so the CIA couldn't find him, and returned to the USSR in 1970. The CIA's files on Bohdan Stahinsky remain classified. In Moscow, the KGB opened 2 new divisions inside its Directorate of Liquid Affairs. Department T for terrorism oversaw assassinations by shooting, poisoning, blowing things up, and subversion. Department V for victory kept track of his assassins' successes. The new name for work being done by Department T was now Direct Action. Declassified CIA documents reveal. And that is it for Chapter 7.